Welcome everyone, dear colleagues, students, friends. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable, which is entitled Alliances and Strategies in the Indo-Pacific, Turbulent Waters for Old Partners. In this webinar, we're going to try to find out how turbulent those waters are for both the European Union and the United States. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at the University of Leuven in Belgium. This event is organized by the America-Europe Fund at KU Leuven. The aim of the fund is to contribute to a better comparative knowledge and understanding of the US and the European Union, including Belgium as the center of the European institutions and NATO. The fund promotes academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research aimed at strengthening comparative knowledge of American and European societies and transatlantic relations. The fund also initiates cooperation and exchanges between the US, the EU, Belgium, and its regions in the fields of education, science, business, culture, diplomacy, and policy making. The America-Europe Fund is hosted at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, a multidisciplinary research center at the University of Leuven. Today's roundtable is also organized in association with ENGAGE. ENGAGE stands for Envisioning a New Governance Architecture for a Global Europe, and it's a Horizon 2020 project which examines how the EU can effectively and sustainably meet strategic challenges by harnessing all of its tools to become a more assertive global actor with a joined up and coherent external action. To that end, it brings together 13 academic institutions and think tanks across Europe to produce state-of-the-art conceptual research, strategic analysis, and policy advice. You can find more information about ENGAGE, its events and publications on its website, engage-eu.eu. This webinar is about the state of transatlantic relations following two major diplomatic initiatives, two major diplomatic events, and some would say diplomatic crises as well. The announcement of the AUKUS deal and the adoption of the European Union strategy to the Indo-Pacific region. But before we delve into the topic, I'm now pleased to introduce you to our distinguished speakers at our roundtable. Ambassador Pierre Vimont is Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe. From March 2016 to January 2017, he served as Special Envoy for the French Initiative for the Middle East Peace Conference. Previously, he had been nominated the personal envoy of President of the European Council, Donald Tusk at the time, to lead the preparations for the Valletta Conference between the EU and the African countries to tackle the causes of illegal migrations and combat human smuggling and trafficking. Pierre Vimont was the first Executive Secretary General of the EAS, the European External Action Service, at the moment of its inception from December 2010 to March 2015. He has also 38 years of diplomatic career with the French Foreign Services, with the Quai d'Orsay, where he served as French ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2010, ambassador to the European Union from 1999 to 2002. He holds the title of Ambassador of France, a dignity bestowed for life to only a few French career diplomats. Currently, his research focuses at the Carnegie Foundation on the European neighborhood policy, transatlantic relations, and French foreign policy. Ambassador Vimont, thank you for being with us today. It's also our pleasure my pleasure actually to introduce you to Professor Stefan Keukelere. Professor Keukelere is Jean Monnet Professor in European Foreign Policy at the Faculty of Social Sciences and at the Leuven International European Studies Institute at the University of Leuven. He's the co-director of the Interdisciplinary Master of European Studies, Transnational and Global Perspectives, and of the Master of Advanced Studies in European Policies and Public Administration at the University of Leuven, and he also teaches at the Masters in International Politics. Professor Keukelere's research and publications on the EU foreign policy focus on EU diplomacy, CFSP, CSTP, informal practices, structural foreign policy, the relations between the EU and the BRICS, and what's called the centering of the analysis and practices of European foreign policy. He is the co-author of the widely used textbook, The Foreign Policy of the European Union. A new edition of the book is about to come out, and his current research project is on the centering European foreign policy analysis, which deals with the question of how European foreign policy can be analyzed from a non-Eurocentric perspective. I must say as well that the panel, unfortunately, is one person short, as the most attentive among you have noticed. Professor Marianne Riedewold, unfortunately, could not join us today. She is a fellow at the Center for European Studies at Berkeley University, California. We will certainly miss her, but I'm sure that, and I dare to say, we have an excess of expertise with both of our panelists today. Now, thank you to both of you to be here with us. Now to the topic of discussion, and please allow me to abuse my role as chair and as moderator to speak for a few more minutes to introduce the topic of today's discussion. So 5 weeks ago, on 15 September 2021, the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom announced the creation of AUKUS. AUKUS, a trilateral security partnership for the Indo-Pacific region. The acronym AUKUS, of course, stands for the countries' names: Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States. As a matter of fact, this kind of acronym seems to be a trend for recent agreements and pacts. One could recall the USMCA agreement that replaced NAFTA, also standing for United States, Mexico, and Canada. If one thing, these acronyms are certainly making it easier to unveil the membership behind these initiatives. But regardless the easy acronym, institutionally, AUKUS is so far little more than an announcement or a joint leader statement made by the US, Australia, and the UK. But surely it's a very high-profile announcement that establishes a pact between these powers that are willing to, and I quote, deepen diplomatic, security, and defense cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. But because the Indo-Pacific is increasingly the center of world affairs, and it includes regional and global powers, this pact, the AUKUS agreement, has global consequences. Through the AUKUS deal, these maritime democracies, as they call themselves in this statement, signal their intention to deepen cooperation with information and technology sharing, foster integration of defense-related technologies, industrial bases, and supply chains. It also focuses on areas of deeper cooperation, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, and undersea capacities. And it's exactly in the undersea capacities that we find the most immediate consequences for Europe, for the EU, and particularly for France. That's because the AUKUS deal, in the AUKUS deal, the US and the UK commit themselves to help the Australian Navy acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which are, of course, propelled by nuclear engines, but do not carry nuclear weapons, for sure. The Australian rationale for this acquisition, analysts say, relates to the increased assertiveness of China towards the government in Australia. While China and Australia have deep economic ties, Australia also needs to ensure its own strategic maritime capacity in its own region, something that the nuclear power submarines can help with, even though the capacity will take years, if not decades, to materialize. Now, the problem is that Australia was already in the process of modernizing its maritime deterrence and underwater fleet with a multi-billion euro deal with France, which is, by the way, one of the few countries in the world mastering nuclear submarine technology. Not only France was losing a multi-billion euro arms trade with AUKUS, but French diplomats and also European allies were largely kept in the dark about the ongoing negotiations between the US, Australia, and the United Kingdom. The announcement of AUKUS came as a shock because Europeans were willing to believe, at least partially, that the new US administration led by President Biden was renewing the American commitment to the transatlantic bond. As a consequence of AUKUS, French President Emmanuel Macron recalls the French ambassador from Australia and from the United States for consultation over what was portrayed as a diplomatic crisis and a quote-unquote stab in the back from an old ally. It was the first time actually in history of the relationship between France and the United States that an ambassador was recalled. For the editorial of Le Monde, a major French newspaper, AUKUS was a sign that the American strategic, economic, and financial interests continue to come first, regardless of the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration. The same Le Monde editorial also mentions that an unfortunate coincidence, the fact that AUKUS was announced the day before the presentation of the European Union's own strategy to the Indo-Pacific. Now, this strategy of the EU aims at strengthening its presence in the region that has become the center of global affairs. For the European Union, at least what appears in the document, the Indo-Pacific is, and I quote, a vast region spanning from the east coast of Africa to the Pacific Islands states, end of quote. This is basically the broadest understanding of the Indo-Pacific region. Research from the European Council of Foreign Relations, for instance, shows that European Union member states themselves have different conceptions of the region and how significant it is for European external action. The strategy of the EU underlines that given the interregional interdependence, the EU should reinforce partnerships with the region, promote rule-based international order, and access to open markets and stable trading environment. The EU's engagements in the region, the strategy goes on, should be principled and long-term. It should be anchored on democracy and human rights, and it should be guided by a multifaceted engagement with China, meaning cooperation on issues of common interest, but also pushing back where there are fundamental disagreements with China. The strategy also puts a lot of emphasis on topical issues such as environmental protection and climate change mitigation, digitalization and cybersecurity, and health and risk reduction. In military and strategic terms, which is the focus of our round the table, the focus is on enhancing the European Union's military presence in the region, including more port calls and joint exercises. Overall, the strategy is often vague and does not really mention the assets of the member states that the member states have in the region. But it does acknowledge the growing and intense competition in the Indo-Pacific, including tensions around contested territories and maritime zones, and also the military buildup. When discussing partners in and for the Indo-Pacific, the strategy mentions ASEAN in the Southeast Asia, the ACP countries of the Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, as well as the so-called Quad formation, the group of more or less like-minded countries of Japan, US, Australia, and India. But of course, it does not mention AUKUS, since AUKUS had just been announced the day before. And this overlap of initiatives that really did not talk to each other is perhaps not as unfortunate as the one of June 2016. And I'm sure both Professor Kelkelere and Ambassador Vimon will recall. Then the European Global Strategy, after months of consultation with the multiple stakeholders, was adopted by the European Union only 2 days after the Brexit referendum. So again, another unfortunate coincidence. Brexit, as we have seen, actually meant Brexit, and the referendum was already an indicator that the strategy needed to be reviewed. 2016 was also the year, by the way, that put additional stress in the transatlantic relations because of the election of Donald Trump. But perhaps most importantly for our discussion today is that the global strategy at the time put the notion of a strategic autonomy of the European Union at the forefront of its ambitious global actor. And it's that we'd like to discuss today. The quest for a European strategic autonomy today, as that of 2016, is intrinsically linked to the transatlantic relations, to the United States and to NATO in particular. And it has various layers. It has certainly the political layer of the strategic autonomously choosing when, how, and with whom, more or less independently to act. And in this layer, we also see how particularly challenging it is for Europeans to agree on joint strategies that are meaningful and not to water down by diverging interests. But we should not forget there's also more material, logistics, and equipment-related autonomy when it comes to strategic autonomy itself. And it is at this particular aspect that the transatlantic relations, or rather the European lack of autonomy, is visible, since the EU still relies heavily on military assets from the United States. So the lack of strategic transatlantic coordinations between these two actors, as illustrated by the AUKUS deal and the EU's strategy to the Indo-Pacific, have all created immense challenges for the future of the transatlantic relationship at a moment when Europeans expected the new US administration to foster stronger cooperation. Our two panelists today have the very challenging task, I must say, of making sense of these two high-profile diplomatic initiatives while connecting them to European foreign policy and to the foreign policy of the member states, and explore how they impact transatlantic relations and Europe's quest for strategic autonomy. Before I give the floor, let me just say that to all our audience here that you can ask questions via the Q&A button that you're going to find at the bottom of your screen. The questions, the button is already open for questions. Do not hesitate to ask them. And please, when possible, state clearly your name and your affiliation. The panelists will be given around 15 minutes for their initial remarks, and then after that, we'll follow up with a more informal debate following questions from the audience. Once again, and sorry for this rather lengthy introduction, I would like to pass on the floor to our first speaker, Ambassador Vimon. A pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours. I believe you have to unmute yourself, Ambassador. There
Yes,
we go.
thank you very much. I was not allowed to activate my speaking micro, so that's why I was silent. Sorry for that. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here to discuss the AUKUS alliance and also the more generally Europe in this Indo-Pacific strategy that we're facing today. And thank you, Gustavo, for your introductory remarks, because I think they're very useful to set up the scenery, the landscape about which we are discussing. The main line I would like to put forward maybe for our discussion, at least from my point of view, is that this whole issue of the Indo-Pacific strategy seems to me to be a kind of perfect illustration of what international relations are today, which is very much related to power politics, to the game of global powers, getting more and more involved, and also the growing intrusion of regional powers also, which want to have a say in what is going on at the moment. And from that point of view, my personal impression is that the EU institution, EU member states are facing a major challenge, because in this power politics game that we're facing today, EU is playing with a different toolbox to some extent. And therefore, to some extent, it is having difficulty in trying to find its right place in the middle of all this. Let me try to go through a few observations with regard to the Indo-Pacific ongoing events to illustrate what I want to say. First comment, as you very rightly say, Gustavo, the AUKUS alliance was a high-profile announcement with not much meat in it for the time being. The most impressive element was, of course, the deal around the submarines and the decision by Australia to change the nature of those submarines from diesel propel-powered submarines to nuclear-powered submarines. And of course, there was a lot of news and buzz made about this and about how French were infuriated by this decision to get rid of the contract they had. I personally think that the French government was not as much infuriated by this end of contract than by something different. After all, if you look at really what was the French share of this whole contract, it was only 1/6 of the total. And furthermore, a very striking point was that the trade unions in the French shipyards didn't pay much attention to this end of contract, which was rather interesting. Because they have a lot of work anyway, and because maybe to some extent they knew that for some time the contract was in sort of difficulty because of the negotiation between Australia and France. Now, what really infuriated the French was the manner in which this whole thing was unfolded and was unwrapped. And the fact that for allies, not only France, but also Europe, as you rightly mentioned, right on the day of the release of the Indo-Pacific strategic communication by the European Union, this announcement of the AUKUS alliance came out of the blue with no prior information. And therefore, for allies, this kind of secrecy looked, to say the least, a bit awkward, and gave the strong impression of Europe being perceived in the eyes of the three new partners in the AUKUS alliance as something of an irrelevant partner in the Indo-Pacific region, a partner that didn't have much leverage, and therefore that was of no real importance in this new deal. And of course, this was not easy to stomach for the Europeans and for France in particular, which prides itself still today as being an important and global player, even if one may have doubts about this. For the French government, this is certainly the case. Don't forget, if you look at the first sentences of the Indo-Pacific communication by the EU that was released on that day, the EU reminds the reader that it is the second trade partner for the whole region, the first investor, foreign investor, and the second provider in terms of humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. So to be somewhat sidelined by the three new partners of the AUKUS alliance was something that was not easy to accept, of course. Let me go just a little bit deeper into this. I think also looking at what was around this whole new alliance, there are three features that stand out and that are to some extent in contrast maybe to what the Europeans are precisely thinking about the whole region. First one is that without saying so entirely, but still very much in the forefront of the mind of the three new allies, and maybe not all that new allies, as we know that in the past they have been working together with other partners in the region on the ANZUS alliance that came out after World War II, or the famous Five Eyes arrangements that they have, the three AUKUS allies with New Zealand and with Canada, which is, as some of you know, an alliance that provides very confidential information between those five partners. So that was not entirely a new thing, but still, there were three features that need to be underlined. One is that this new partnership looks like being very much centered around China, the Chinese challenge, the Chinese threat, and therefore looks like an alliance and sort of anti-China alliance. Second feature, it has more than anything else a very strong security dimension. It is about military alliance, about pushing back against cyber attacks, all sorts of military Chinese aggression in the maritime zone, and therefore about how to push back against those security threats and to enhance the military capabilities of these three allies in the region. And the third feature, I think, which was also important and which was more as a question than as anything else, is that will this AUKUS alliance open up to other partners in the region? Will the other Quad partners, namely India, Japan, and South Korea, join this group? Is this the intention of this new alliance? Could there be even other Asian partners being involved in this one? Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, Philippines, so on and so forth. You could add a large number of countries on that list, Vietnam, etc. What's the purpose of all this? And therefore, if we go ahead in that direction, where is the seat, the place, is there room for Europe in this kind of alliance? And of course, that's some of the many questions that this initiative brought immediately to the minds of the Europeans. And of course, and that's my second comment, it brought immediately for Europeans a sort of very uncomfortable position. Because as far as one could see exactly where the Indo-Pacific strategy of the European Union wants to go, it is, in Joseph Borrell's own words, the High Representative of the European Union, Indo-Pacific strategy was about cooperation, much more than confrontation. And therefore, it seems to a certain extent to be at loggerheads with the AUKUS alliance. At least looking back at the three elements I was just listing a few minutes ago, the Europeans certainly don't share exactly the choice made by the AUKUS three partners. Europe is not centered on and not focused on the straightforward confrontation with China. You remember the European strategic communication on China. China is can be a partner. It can be a competitor. It can even be a systemic rival, but it can be a partner. We can work together on issues like climate change, on the future of new tech, on the possibility of cooperation in the field of energy, so on and so forth. So for us to look at an island and at an alliance that is mainly focused on pushing back against China, and secondly, dealing mostly with security matters, and thirdly, trying to bring all Asian partners maybe into that alliance of straight confrontation with China, is certainly not what Europe is thinking about when it's talking about an Indo-Pacific strategy. And therefore, the point for the Europeans is, does this mainstream of European thinking with regard to that region a path that could find its way somewhere in the current AUKUS alliance, or are we going to be totally sidelined with our own arguments there? Is there a place? Does European have a voice? These are questions that we put on the table. We have been perceived as a somewhat irrelevant partner, as I was saying before, not being priorly consulted, and discovering this new alliance coming out of the blue, as I was saying before. And furthermore, if the whole purpose of this is about confrontation and not cooperation, if the whole idea is about, to some extent, moving as far as decoupling our economic links with China, and looking for less and less dependency with Chinese economy up to the point when we disconnect and decouple from China, is this really what the Europeans are thinking about? Is this even simply realistic in economic terms? Many Europeans have doubts, and therefore for us, this is a major issue that we have there. And of course, there is a real need to discuss more with the Americans on all of this. And this brings, of course, the third observation I wanted to make, which is very much related to the Transatlantic partnership. And of course, in this context, the whole question of NATO and what is the NATO mission with regard to this Indo-Pacific strategy from the US and this new AUKUS alliance. This brings about some uneasy choices for NATO and for the Transatlantic Alliance. Three of them, in fact, that we are to some extent working on already inside NATO circles, without entirely finding a way out at the moment. The first one is about where does the EU stand amid this new thinking in terms of the Indo-Pacific importance and growing importance in the US strategy. For the US, of course, the confrontation, the rivalry with China has become the main issue. We all know about the Asian pivot dating back to Obama, the Obama administration, which is very much there. Where does Europe and where does NATO find its place in this Asian pivot? Should NATO strictly remain tasked to what has been his mission, namely the collective defense of Europe, of the European Western allies of America, or should it take into account this new Chinese challenge, not only inside the European continent, but also in the Indo-Pacific region? In other words, should NATO move into the Indo-Pacific region? Does it has the military capabilities to do this? And should it go there? Or should we look at something different? Europe sticking to its main goal, the collective defense of Europe, and helping America in a new kind of division of labor, with Europe taking more care of its neighborhood, while America is being focused now mostly on the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, this brings all about the whole point about whether the transatlantic partners of the US and NATO as such should become a major player in the Indo-Pacific region and the whole Indo-Pacific strategy. And of course, the consequences of this are numerous. It means in terms of alliance and partnership, where does the EU land? If we stick to our current tasking, the collective defense of Europe, should we stay out of the Indo-Pacific area? And therefore our Indo-Pacific strategy, which was looking for new alliance and new partners in Asia, Japan, India, South Korea, Indonesia, so on and so forth, do we just let this go and not take it as a priority for EU foreign policy? In terms of military structures and military capabilities, if we are tasked with sticking to collective defense and being more present and more active in our neighborhood, in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, in Eastern Europe, what does it mean in terms of EU capabilities and EU strategic and EU defense and security policy? And then what does it mean also in terms of our relationship with America, and the way the transatlantic partnership should morph into maybe something different with this new division of labor? How do we work together with a global power, the United States, which will be more and more focused and concentrated on the Indo-Pacific? These are real questions. And as always with the Europeans, we may not see among the 27 member states eye to eye on this and where we should go. And of course, this will certainly complicate the whole discussion on strategic autonomy, on the strategic compass that should be adopted in the spring of next year, because this brings some additional question to what was already a rather complicated file. And this is exactly where we are at the moment. And therefore, I leave it there because I think I've taken already too much of your time. But I'm sure we'll come back to this with the question and answer session.
All right. I just thank you very much, Ambassador Vimon. Thank you, Pierre. I just faced the same issues of trying to unmute myself, but I managed. Thank you so much for all this food for thought and for highlighting the, let's say, the long-term aspects also of the AUKUS, but also the consequences for the EU and of course the consequences for NATO, right? As you very well pointed out, NATO was created at a time when the North Atlantic was perhaps the center of world affairs. Now we're shifting towards the Indo-Pacific, and what's the future role for NATO? And what I take from your intervention as well is the difficult choices that Europe has now facing, the strategic competition between China and the US. What is desirable for Europe, and in a second moment, what's actually realistic, right? As you say, for Europe, what are the realistic choices for Europe? And a third aspect that I take from particularly from your intervention is the fact that strategic autonomy at the end of the day does not have to be a global strategic autonomy, right? Europe can also be autonomous in its own neighborhood, but not necessarily far away, let's say, in the Pacific. Now, let me move on to Professor Keukelere, who can certainly shed some light from the European Union perspective and the ins and outs of the institutions themselves. Stefan, on to you. Thank you very much for joining us as well.
Okay, thank you, Gustavo, for the introduction, and I managed to unmute myself. So thank you for the invitation, and obviously it's a pity that we don't have, first of all, our colleague from Berkeley, because then we would have received also an American perspective, or Stephen Everts, who was initially also on the program from the External Action Service, because obviously he would have been able to provide a perspective from the EU side, which I can't do, because I'm still an external observer of the whole process. A set of comments. First of all, I will focus on some of your questions that you asked us on the AUKUS, and then focus secondly on the so-called strategy. First of all, it has been mentioned also in your introduction, why was the EU not informed? Why were they kept in the dark? I would say, why would the United States and United Kingdom and Australia even think about consulting the EU or European countries? So I think it's completely logical that they were excluded and not informed, because it's a security strategy, and this implies that the EU has nothing to offer. Most European countries have nothing to offer. Even France has not much to offer. And from that perspective, if you also see what the nature of EU foreign policy is, I find it quite logical. But I understand that the French were rather angry. Also for another reason, I think that the French needed the submarine deal, and not that much for the trade dimension or for the employment dimension in France, but particularly because also if you can sell submarines to Australia, just as if you can sell airplanes to Saudi Arabia, this provides also you with access. For the French, that would have been access to the Pacific, that would have been access to information, because if you sell submarines, there's also information exchange. We have intelligence, and France could have been present much more in the Indo-Pacific area, much more than it is the case now, because now it has some territories, but it's rather limited. The submarines would have been a real major new asset for the French. So I think they were not only upset, they were really disappointed, because it diminished their potential strategic reach in the area. But so my first point is, I find it perfectly normal that the EU and European countries were not informed and were not involved. Second point is, I think it's very good for the EU and European countries that they were not involved. Because if they would have been part of this alliance, then they would have lost the opportunity the potential opportunity to define their own course towards ASEAN, towards China. And then they would have been embedded much more in this animosity between China and America, and the EU and European countries would have lost the opportunity to take a different course. So I think it's not only normal that they were not included, I think it's also very positive, because otherwise it should have followed much more the line of the United States. Thirdly, what does it mean? That was also one of the questions. does the EU have, should it revise its strategy? Well, it should take its strategy much more serious. I mean, the strategy towards the Indo-Pacific area, because now, as I will say in a couple of minutes, it's a catalog. It's an interesting catalog, but it's not a strategy. So it should take it more serious and try to amend it and to include real priorities, real innovative actions, which are at this moment not really included. So that's the first point. It has to take it serious. And secondly, it also has been mentioned by Ambassador Vimont too. It should also take the 4 components of the China strategy serious. Because as Ambassador Vimont indicated, or perhaps also you indicated it, EU sees China as a cooperation partner, negotiating partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival. Well, for each of these 4 components, both the partnership components and the competitor and rival components, the EU really has to take serious what it means. And it has to select ways to make it clear to China that in each of these 4 dimensions, the EU has to be taken serious. And also here at this moment, it remains too vague. So it should not rethink its strategies, but it should take its strategies more serious by including more concrete actions. Because it's only then that the EU will be taken serious, somewhere in between the approach of the Americans, the British, and Australians. And by the way, I understand the concerns of the Australians. And on the other hand, China, but also, for instance, the ASEAN countries that also do not want to choose between the two. So in this sense, the EU can align itself to ASEAN countries, but also other countries. Then if you look at the strategy, first of all, it's not at all an EU-India-Pacific strategy. It's a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So the title is perfect on the first view. It's not an Indo-Pacific strategy, it's a strategy for cooperation. And in this sense, you might say that it's a typical EU strategy. It's very comprehensive. It includes a lot of policy fields. It's a catalog of where cooperation might be strengthened. So here on that point, we might say it's fine. It's not nothing special. It's just what the EU is doing. That is these kind of general strategies. And it's also fine that it doesn't tackle the security problems and that it does not provide a strategy to tackle the conflicts because the EU simply has no means to do that. Also, the EU member states have nothing to offer. So I think it's even fine that it's not too much included this security dimension because the EU has nothing to offer. What I find more problematic is that this catalog is, if you read it carefully, and it's only 18 pages or 20 pages, so it's easy to read, it is mainly a reflection, first of all, of what the EU is already doing. And then it just indicates that it will, and now I will read some parts of it, the EU will seek to play a stronger role in the ASEAN security architecture. That's really impressive. It will seek to play a stronger role. So that's not really important. It will intensify its dialogues. It will step up activities. That's all security. I read some parts on ocean governance. So that's a more technical issue. The EU will take forward the action to strengthen ocean governance. Okay, fine. It will continue supporting. It will remain an active member. It also intends to become a member. The EU will continue its efforts to increase the performance, etc. So all these so-called ambitions in this document are very general and very vague. And this brings me to the next point. The main problem might be, and here it's a pity that Steven Everts is not present because he might counter my hypothesis, and perhaps I'm totally wrong. But I have the impression that the EU in this strategy for cooperation is mainly reflecting what it is doing, saying that it will do a little bit more, but that it is not taking into account the real interests, priorities of those countries. And perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps Steven Everts would have said, no, it's not true what you say, because what we have listed is what we learned from the countries over there, because they consider it as important. But nowhere do I see in this text the mentioning that, for instance, the ASEAN countries see this as priorities, and we will indeed support them in reaching these priorities. Nowhere do I read that the EU, and that should be a strategy, in the long term wants to achieve this kind of goal, this kind of relationship, this kind of situation. The strategy should focus on the long term. In the next 10, 20 years, we want to have that. We will accept these initiatives to pursue these objectives, and that's not included. And here I'd like to refer to a book of my colleague Pan from Fudan University, who said Europeans don't know what a strategy is. Strategy is you think in the long term, and you're willing to bring offers. And that's my next point. If the EU is interested in the priorities, if it wants to be an actor in between China and America, what has it to offer to ASEAN countries, to India, to even Australia? Well, even Australia, to Australia. Has it something to offer? And is it willing to accept the costs that are related to offering something? And to give an example, is the EU willing to accept concessions with regard to trade to Indonesia concerning palm oil? Is it accepting some perspectives of India? Is it accepting what ASEAN countries ask from the EU? Or does it just want the other countries to do what the EU wants them to do? And that's also part of my first critical comment, that I said, well, the EU has nothing to offer in a military and security sense, but has the EU also to offer something in the other policy fields that are listed in the strategy for cooperation. And many of them look interesting, and many of them might in the longer term be useful, but you don't see in this text what the EU can offer. So I fear the EU has nothing to offer military, and that's normal, because that's the nature of the beast of the EU. But I fear that also the EU at this moment has not enough to offer to make sure that it can play a role there. Related to this is the EU strategy on cooperation. For cooperation also does not indicate what the EU can learn from these countries, because it's always this kind of Eurocentric perspective. But the EU can perhaps also learn from the ASEAN approach towards security in the region, or we can learn from how to tackle the COVID-19 crisis. Some of the countries, democratic and non-democratic countries, have been rather successful. And also here, I do not see in this strategy for cooperation that the EU is taking the partners serious and seeing them as a real partners. So that would be another point I would be interested to hear from people in the External Action Service to see, or in the Commission to see what they intend to learn, to translate this strategy in a strategy that's also interesting for the others, but where also we can learn. Then another comment I can add is that, and here I refer to what I say to my students in my European Foreign Policy class in Leuven, that is, there's this tension between, on the one hand, policy objectives. That means that certain member states really want to have an impact in the field, but other countries don't care. Most of the countries don't care too much about the Indo-Pacific. And this has been mentioned, I think, by you, by Ambassador Vimont, in the recent report of one of the think tanks in London. It was made clear that most countries don't care. Germany has a strategy, France has a strategy, the Netherlands, but for other countries, it's not very important. Implying that in any case, does this strategy is an attempt to move forward, but it does not include the expectation from the French, obviously. And for many countries, most important is that they can give the impression that they're more present, that they're present in the area, but without contributing really to the challenges over there. And if you speak about the current tensions within the EU about do we have to follow more the Atlantic line, I mean the American line, or pursue a European perspective and approach, I think this reflects what has been at the heart of the problems of EU foreign policy since, well, since 60 years. That is the tension between Atlantic solidarity, and for some countries that's still essential for historical reasons, but also for security reasons, or do we pursue this European autonomy? Perhaps the last point to conclude, that's just, I want to indicate that I totally agree with Ambassador Vimont. The EU should not try to play a security role in that region because it doesn't make sense. And all attempts that we might have will be rather senseless in that context. But instead of that, the EU should try to play a larger role in this environment because America will find that less important. He's already much less involved. And so that will be the main objective for the EU. So to conclude, I think the main issue is the EU should try to take itself more serious by taking the partners in the strategy for cooperation more serious, and by just including also their priorities and accepting offers. Concerning security or military security, I don't think that the EU should even try to play a role, but should concentrate on its needs. And I'm open for further questions and comments later on.
Thank you so much, Professor Keukeler. Thank you, Stefan. Again, very insightful comments as well. Provocative, many of those, I must say as well. Calling our attention that also, and I think Ambassador Vimon would agree with that, that as he said, that weapons deals with regarding the submarines was not so much about jobs and economics, but was about access, right? Access to a particular country. And coming from Brazil myself, I cannot help but think that France has a long-term submarine deal with Brazil, right? And how that particular deal has solidified the relationship between both countries so much that we don't talk much about that, but Brazil will end up having nuclear submarines before Australia, because this type of technologies, they take a lot of time to be brought online as well. And not many countries that can do that, and not many countries that can offer that kind of possibility neither. And thank you also, Stefan, for calling our attention that the strategy, in a way, it's very Eurocentric in the sense that it doesn't come out as a document that has is the product of consultations to a certain extent. We don't know if those consultations were there or not, and for that, indeed, I agree that we should bring in next time a voice familiar with the ins and outs of the institutions themselves. But if anything, the strategy is missing the other side. And the last comment that I take from your intervention is that at the end of the day, it's actually good that Europe was not part of AUKUS, right? Because if it was part of AUKUS, the choice would already be made, right? In the sense, well, the choice was made for Australia, right? We have many analysts coming out and saying that for a certain period, Australia was hesitating perhaps between China and the US. We don't know to what extent that hesitation was for real or not. But now it's clear that Australia no longer has the choice because it already made the choice. It's clearly on the American camp. But Europe, it still has room for maneuvering. In that sense, not being part of it gives the chance of more in-depth strategic thinking for the future. We have one question from the audience. I also have questions from myself. Let me remind everyone that the Q&A button is open. You can type your question there. We're going to make sure to move those questions to the panelists. Let me start by asking both of you perhaps a question on how, in the long-term perspective, the AUKUS deal will be remembered. Will it be more about Australia at the end of the day? Will it be more about, let's say, the United States and the United Kingdom committing to Australia's security and Australia itself making the choice? And perhaps we're going to look back in time and say, look, perhaps the Europeans just overemphasize the importance of AUKUS. Perhaps the Americans were right in a way of not really consulting with us because that was their deal in the Anglophone sphere, and that was it. Or will it be remembered as a more important critical juncture in transatlantic relations? So that's a question perhaps to both of you. I have a question for Ambassador Vimon in particular, which is about the upcoming French presidency of the European Council, right? The Council of the European Union, French presidency upcoming next year, and how the AUKUS deal and the whole turn towards the Indo-Pacific, how has that, if at all, changed in your perspective the French approach to the upcoming presidency and its overall objectives of French foreign policy for next year? And I would also bring a question that relates to the third country in the AUKUS deal that we tend to not talk about very much, but it's there, it's very close. It's a transatlantic partner that by accident of nature is on this side of the Atlantic, but it's the UK, right? So what would be, in the view of both of you, the consequences of AUKUS for the relationship between the UK and the European Union, and in particular, I must stress the relationship between the UK and France, right? Because I imagine there was certainly a lot of strategic thinking in London, right, regarding the impact on the bilateral relationship. And I would like to have your point of view on that as well. We have questions coming from the audience. I'm gonna group a couple of those as well for this round. Walter Kennis, formerly from the European Commission, is asking a challenging question rather. Do we know what the ASEAN countries think about AUKUS? Difficult question. I'm going to leave that to both of you. It's a challenging one because, of course, there are 10 countries in ASEAN, and I'm sure they have very different foreign policies. And Mohammed Katagay-Akar is asking the ambassador, can the AUKUS be an indication that the Biden administration will pursue the same policy regarding China as the Trump administration? So here we have a question that refers to what is, at the end of the day, the difference between the Trump and the Biden administration regarding China, and I would add here, well, regarding the transatlantic relations, right? Do we see a market difference that goes beyond rhetoric? And those are the questions that we have for this round. There are other questions coming up, but let me throw it back to both of our panelists. Rather challenging questions coming from the audience, also because it's a very timely topic. Ambassador Vimon, may we start with you?
Thank you. Yes, all these questions are very interesting and not easy to answer, but let me try to give a few comments there. On your broad question about how will the alliance be remembered in the future. Sorry, I may be wrong, but my impression is that this could be seen and could be perceived as we go along as one further step, and maybe a very important one, in the way the United States has mobilized in the region. There has been, and coming back to the question that was also asked, this mobilization has started with Obama, took a new turn with Trump, no doubt about it. Biden is moving further on. I still think in a different way from Trump, more professional, if only, but with just as much determination as the two previous administrations. One point I would like to underline, because I think we need to look at this with great attention. This growing mobilization against China has not prevented the Biden administration from starting some sort of conversation with the Chinese regime. There has been, at least if I am correct, 2 phone conversations recently between Joe Biden and President Xi. There has been several meetings between officials on the 2 sides also. So let's not underestimate the ability of both sides, while taking strong public position against each other, to still be very eager to keep channels of communication and possible ways of trying to move forward and find some ways of reaching some sort of agreements. So let's be aware of that, and let's be careful about this. With regard to the next French presidency of the European Union, what has been, I think, one of the most striking points about the French reaction to the AUKUS deal was the way the French transferred the whole issue into a European dimension immediately. And if you look at the communiqué after the first phone conversation between Joe Biden and Macron, the 3 issues that came out of this was, how can the US help even more France and EU member states involved in Sahel? How can we improve our conversation with regard to the 2 different Indo-Pacific strategy? And thirdly, what about the future of European strategic autonomy with regard to NATO and the future of the new NATO strategic concept and so on. So it was about moving this whole issue into the EU framework and the EU discussion. So you will hear plenty of the Indo-Pacific strategy, if only because, and I agree very much with you, Professor, about the fact that the current communication has no plan. It's mostly a catalogue. And of course, as we move into the year ahead with the French presidency and maybe afterwards with the Czech presidency, there will be a need for what I will call the sort of roadmap for this communication. What do we do with this? As I think still today, there is a need for a more precise and detailed roadmap with regard to the China strategic communication from 2019. There is a need for the Europeans to be much more precise, much more detailed, to reach out to their Asian partners and to try to work with them. And I totally agree that this is definitely the one focus and the major priority for Europe. Europe, in my opinion, has maybe one asset there, is that it has a long-term vision about what it wants to do. But in order to implement that vision, it needs to be much more agile, much more proactive. It needs to add action to what is mostly today speeches. If I would quote Sigmund Gabriel, who used to say, you remember that Europe is a herbivore in the middle of carnivores. Europe should start being a little bit more of a carnivore as it moves there. And it has to do it smartly. It may be a different way from the other global powers that are there, but certainly it needs to be more powerful, to be ready to use its leverage with its very important assets that it has, economic, trade, new tech here and there, energy, climate change, and the asset it has there. It needs to apply all these assets in this huge region that we're facing there. And I think that is very important. With regard to our ASEAN partners or other partners in the region, what I can gather out of my discussion with many of them is that they're very much looking for a more precise European vision of where Europe wants to go. You know, what many of our Asian partners are saying is that we understand that you have a different position from the US and we're interested in that, but please make it more clear. Let us have a better understanding of where you want to go. Where is the landing spot for European strategy in the Indo-Pacific region? They still don't know. And therefore, as it was rightly said by you, Professor, it's about starting a dialogue with these different countries, which, by the way, may have different opinions one from another. India may not be thinking exactly the same thing as Japan, or certainly Japan may not be thinking exactly the same as South Korea, and they may even have strong differences between themselves. So it's also about Europe starting an interesting conversation with each and every one of them, taking into account the differences there and trying to find a way of moving forward. Now, of course, what I think our American partners would tell us is that all this is very nice, but we have no time for this. You know, the fire is already there in the house. And today, what is the issue is about how to prevent China from moving in an aggressive way against Taiwan and being more present in the South China Sea. And are you Europeans ready to put your deeds where your mouth is, and have you the capabilities to do that? And the reality is that, and we all know that, we don't have. Even the French, they may go with one or two submarines, but they're not, certainly not at the same level of capabilities as the Americans, and they are still far away from that region, even if they have some territories. So it's finding the right balancing act between this lack of military capabilities, but the strong economic and non-military assets that the Europeans have. And secondly, it's about finding the right balance between cooperation and confrontation, or I would say, from the European perspective, the ability to push back against China and to refuse to go into the kind of Chinese rhetoric that is being employed. The way the Chinese are being more and more dismissive with the international law, with the decisions by the by the International Court of Justice with regard to the South China Sea pretensions of China. It's about defending the multilateral system and speaking loud and clear about all of this. This is where the Europeans can be useful and can have an added value. And I think that's important. Last question, and I apologize for being too long, UK on all of this. I think we're stuck with the UK for some time now with this simple fact that both sides, EU on one side, UK on the other side, wants to convince the other side that they are right, for the Europeans that Brexit was wrong and it's going to be a terrible failure for the UK. And the UK wants absolutely to convince the EU that the EU is broke and that is going to decline and disappear at some stage. Look at what's going on at the moment on the rule of law and our divisions on migration, so on and so forth. As long as you have this kind of narrative on both sides, I don't see how we can start a constructive dialogue. Both sides, and here really I blame both sides, need to lower the temperature of their mutual political narrative. But I'm not naive. We're not there yet, and we will need more time. So I think we're still in for some terrible arguments, difficult discussion on the Northern Ireland Protocol or the fisheries. And I don't see immediately and very soon the start of a dialogue on how we could work together on a security policy where UK assets would be brought into the EU. It was already very difficult when the UK was inside the European Union. I think it's going to be even more difficult now that they are out. And we have to be patient there. I've been too long, Gustavo, and I apologize.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Ambassador Vimon. Insightful answers. Let me move straight because we are starting to get quite a lot of questions. So I'm going to move straight to Stefan for the answer. Let me just add one more question, Stefan, if I may, which is exactly about the strategy of the EU. And at the end of the day, you say that it's a catalog, and perhaps you could shed light on explaining why is it a catalog? Is it because it's so difficult to come up with a strategy in today's global order, or is it more about the divergence of interests and opinions on the European side, right? We all know that France reacted very differently compared to Germany to the AUKUS deal, even though, of course, Germany paid a little bit of lip service supporting France. It was not as outraged as France, by no means. So perhaps you can shed light a little bit on the differences of interest on the European side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gustavo. First of all, on the British dimension, I think that in London, they opened several bottles of champagne to celebrate the fact that the French were excluded. So I think they found it great, I suppose. More serious is that indeed, when you increase your intelligence sharing and your cooperation and your joint armament programs with another set of countries that were also former colonies, then in any case, it will make it more difficult to share this intelligence and to cooperate with European continental countries. So here I fear indeed that this will make it for a long time more difficult. Up to the moment that suddenly they see that they need each other. And then I mean they, the French and the British. If there's certainly a conflict where they need each other, I think then they can cooperate. On the question, how will it be remembered? Well, perhaps we have to look at the Cold War after the Second World War. The situation in 1949 in the American-Soviet Union relations, and then 10, 20, 30 years later. I hope we do not have to look at it as just one step in an escalation that made it impossible for the Europeans to have another kind of relationship with the Chinese that also included this partnership dimension. And there's a real risk, I think, that we have this escalation, even not in a military conflict, but then in a kind of conflict where everything is fixed, where everything is indeed frozen, no more allowing the Europeans or European countries to have another policy in the United States. So I hope that we are not in this kind of process. Then the question of Walter Kennis. Walter Kennis, who was a former colleague of us in the Master of European Studies and who was also civil servant in the Commission. So I think Walter knows more about that. But what do the ASEANs really think? First of all, well, I didn't ask them the last couple of weeks or months, but I think that they are also, several of these countries are in between these two blocks and also want to have a separate policy, but they will only consider the EU as interesting or French or European countries if we offer them something. And that's linked to what you said on the catalogue. Why is it the catalogue? Because there's a divergence of interest, but also because only a limited number of countries have strategic views of what it means to have a policy that has an impact in 10, 20 years, looking at what we want to reach within 10, 20 years and adapting our actions in function of that and accepting offers. And I think that if you ask the ASEAN countries, what kind of offers do you like us to make to really make a difference in your region? Then we might get answers that are useful, but perhaps also painful. On the other hand, and here referring again to the question of Walter Kennis, the problem might be that the ASEAN countries also feel, or some of them might also feel that they have to move in the direction of AUKUS, and that they will need security guarantees. And these security guarantees will not come from the French, but potentially from the United States. And it's related to what Ambassador Vimont said. What will be the next step? Now we have 3 countries, but there might be other countries that gradually also become part of this alliance. I think that's the most important thing I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan. Then, well, if other countries join, we're certainly going to need another acronym, right? Because this one is tailor-made. Let me bring in other questions from the audience. We actually have questions from relating to India. We didn't talk much about India as of now, and also regarding the danger of escalation. I think Professor Kilkelea already mentioned that. But first, Andres Sanchez is asking, and perhaps that's a question for Ambassador Vimont, from a New Delhi's perspective, does the AUKUS deal open a window of opportunity, in particular in its relationship to France? So basically, the fact that India is not included in the AUKUS deal, does it open a window of opportunity for France interaction with India? We know that India has had in the recent months a border confrontation with China, and it's also perhaps leaning in the direction, more firmly in the direction of the United States. But to what extent does that also open a chance for France to interact with India? We also have a question from a student, Young Yus Jen from Taiwan, who is basically at the center of all of these issues that we are discussing. She rather argues that in a way it's better than the EU is not involved militarily in the region, because that would escalate the tensions in the Taiwan Strait. But she also asks if the EU can play a role on a rather different domain, which is addressing the supply chain crisis. So here is where the EU perhaps has more teeth and can play as a carnivore, which is in trade dimension. Can the EU play a role in alleviating the supply chain crisis, and particularly the crisis of semiconductors worldwide. And finally, we have a question from Kulei Ruot, who is a student also of the Master of European Politics at KU11, and I do hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Is there a danger that, and that's perhaps a question for both of you, is there a danger that AUKUS is a step into the escalation of the confrontation and the rivalry between China and the United States? We know that AUKUS, in a sense, did not threaten the power of the Chinese Communist Party within China, so which is definitely a red line for any relationship with China. But on the other hand, China has been reacting rather assertively to many of the foreign policy initiatives of countries in its neighborhood and from the United States. So is this going to lead to an escalation? And finally, from Kuyek, who wrote a question regarding the UK. Is the fact that UK is part of AUKUS simply explained by the fact that it is in a honeymoon season after Brexit and looking for as many global agreements as it can have? To those, that's already a lot of questions. So I'm gonna bring it back to our panelists. And hopefully we're going to have time to go to both of you on those questions. We still have 15 minutes, so it should be fine. Ambassador Vimon, first with you, please.
Thank you. Maybe just before very quickly coming back to a question that was raised before, why are these communication a bit of a catalog? From my own experience, it's usually because those who draft those communication don't want to rock the boat. You know, they're facing member states which can be quite often on different patterns and therefore on different paths with different ideas, divergences, even divisions or strong division. I think both of you related to the fact that France and Germany may not have exactly the same point of view with regard to Indo-Pacific and the way the EU should get involved into that region. So when you're drafting a communication on that sort, you try to go for the lower common denominator. And this is why at the end of the day, those strategic communication seem to be under-delivering to some extent, and hence this uneasiness that one can feel when reading those papers that something is missing and that more should be done. I close that point. Does AUKUS open an opportunity for France? In other words, could France be invited to join AUKUS, and would France be interested in joining AUKUS? I'm not entirely sure at the moment. This is said in very diplomatic terms. I personally think for the time being, France would try to avoid that. If only because they want to push Europe in front at the moment, as much as France itself. And secondly, because more and more, the idea is that we need to listen to what all our Asian partners have to say. Look at how France is reacting to the moment to this idea that NATO should be more and more involved with the 4 Asian partners that they have picked up recently, namely Australia, Japan, South Korea, and India. France is of the opinion that why should we limit ourselves to these 4? Why shouldn't we discuss with others also who may have a lot to say? And that it would be important to listen to them and maybe, as you were saying, Professor, come up with some offers towards them. So my impression is that in this complicated geopolitical game, France wants to keep its game open and to be as much in tune with our different Asian partner and the ASEAN organization and regional organization also, before taking any bold move in that region. On the whole issue of supply chain and semiconductors, etc., etc. I would like to come back to what I was saying earlier. Here, one of the real challenges for Europe is the way the thinking seems to be going nowadays in some quarters in Washington, which is reaching out for some sort of decoupling between China and the rest of the world economy. Is this realistic? Is there any chance of this kind of bold move succeeding? This is an idea that can be nourished in administration circles, you know, in governments, etc. But how does private enterprise react to that? You know, when you're asking them to change completely their supply chains, are they ready to move along? Ask Apple, Google, and all these people, which have built up their whole empire around this very close connection with Taiwan, Hong Kong, mainland China, and which may have their own thoughts about all this. And this is where I think Europe should go. Europe should be very much at the forefront of the thinking at the moment on all of this. Is it realistic to go for decoupling? Isn't what we're looking for is more of less dependency towards some of our main customers and providers? Isn't that more of this kind of less dependency that we should be looking for? And to try to bring more realism in this discussion. I think there Europe has a real leverage, first of all, and this is where it should be playing. Among other things, and I come back to what I was saying about the need to support multilateral processes. In WTO, the World Trade Organization, Europe should be the champion of the rules of WTO and the way all countries belonging to WTO should abide by these rules. And that goes for China, like other partners. And I think we should be very much in the forefront of the campaign for this. Is AUKUS a step to more escalation? Yes, it could be. And this is where I think we need to be smart in terms of crisis management and should be very careful. Each step in this very tense region, full of possible potential incidents and risk of growing escalation, should convince Europe that maybe it has a role to play in, lowering the tension and trying to find ways of moving forward. Once again, this doesn't mean that Europe should be naive. Europe should clearly state who is at fault with regard to the respect to international law and international principles. That means that when necessary, we should speak loud and clear, as I was saying before, with regard to some of the Chinese assertive action in the region. But at the same time, we should call for cooperation and not confrontation. We should be able to do this kind of balancing act. And this is where I think we should be aware and more confident, self-confident of what Europe could be. Not feeling that by being sidelined by the main actors in the region, we should just remain silent. No, we should go back there and be and play our role on this whole playground, I think. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Going back there and perhaps offering something better, a better deal. In a way, being more of an omnivore rather than a carnivore or a herbivore as well. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Moving on to Professor Kyokalere. You have 3-4 minutes for all those questions.
Perfect, in 3 minutes. First of all, on the Franco-Indian relationship, I can't say something interesting on that, but interesting is that in May, there was for the first time since a very long time, a meeting between the Indian Prime Minister, Modi, and the heads of state and government of the European Union. So that was for the first time that, first of all, India took that serious, perhaps also because it was a virtual meeting, that makes it easier. But also that most of the European colleagues were present. And that already indicates that this cooperation between India and the EU, that in the past was not always that easy, that we might move in a new direction. Interesting is that Prime Minister Modi said that he appreciated that the EU would take a more strategic approach. The question is once again whether they will do that. On supply chain crisis, interesting question and difficult to answer, because the EU might play a role within the context of what is called the strategic autonomy, but this also requires that the EU further develops and adapts its industrial policy, because it implies that you change your industrial policy, that you have a more active industrial policy to make sure that more products are produced within the EU, that you also adapt your competition policy. And here you see a nice link between external policies and foreign policy and internal policies. And they're really very much interrelated here. That's also linked to the decoupling. It can also work to some extent, because as Ambassador Vimont said, the economies are so interrelated, and also, for instance, Germany, but also other countries are really that much depending on exporting, but also importing products also from China, particularly from China, that they might diversify, but this has limits, and you can't do that much in just 5 to 10 years' time. If you think about industrial policy, this will only have an impact within 10 to 20 years' time. So it's not something that can be done very quickly. On de-escalating, I think the best role that you can play is to try to find countries that are credible in the region and to support them in their escalation efforts. That might be ASEAN countries, that might be other countries. But I don't think that the EU or European countries alone are really credible, but they might support what is done by other actors in this area. And that again implies the EU has to listen and to try to support what is done in the region. And that's all my 3 minutes, I fear. Well,
that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, Professor Kjolkaleere. Thank you, Stefan. If there is we have more questions, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. If I have one lesson, there are many lessons to take from this discussion, but thinking about the European Union's quest for multilateral and rules-based order, we usually think of that as being the promotion of the rules in a context in which the European Union can flourish. But listening to your talk as well, it might also have to do with the defense of multilateralism to avoid decoupling, as Ambassador Vimont said, and to avoid the solidification of two different camps, right? As if we are back to 1949 again, right? So the defense of multilateralism is also about, in a way, defending the ongoing connections between the two major rivals that are coming to the forefront, right? And if the EU can do that a little bit, it would also be avoiding to make a difficult choice, right? And could also merge cooperation with a little bit of a strategic thinking in security and defense. But that's just one of the many lessons, as I said, that we can take from these discussions. For those who are watching us live, you can watch it again, because this is being recorded and will certainly be made available on the website. Let me thank once again Ambassador Vimont and Professor Kjolkaleere for sharing your thoughts with us. AUKUS, I have the feeling, is something that we're going to come back to in a few months, in a few years, because relevant or not, we're going to keep on talking about it. And it has been a pleasure to listen to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Have a good